My name is Nikola Tesla. It is the year 1889. I'm writing this late, as I usually do my best thinking after the city has quieted and the day has finally loosened its grip. Night allows things to be honest. Systems reveal themselves when they are no longer performing for an audience. By most accounts, I have already succeeded. The alternating current system now works in practice, not just in theory. The induction motor behaves as I knew it would, efficiently and without unnecessary loss. Power can travel farther now, cleaner, with less waste. The demonstrations were convincing. The contracts followed. There was money, more than I had ever required, transferred to my name with surprising ease. I accepted it without ceremony. Money has never been a convincing argument. It is a side effect, nothing more. A measure others insist upon using to validate work that should stand on its own merits. I did not design the system to enrich myself. I designed it because the world was wasting energy, and waste is a kind of disorder I find difficult to ignore. Efficiency is a form of respect. When a system functions properly, it does not draw attention to itself. It simply works. That has always been my preference. I'm not interested in spectacle. I am interested in solutions that disappear into daily life and make it quietly better. The success of the system did not excite me in the way people expected. It did not make me restless either. What it did was confirm something I already suspected, that the larger problems were still untouched. I live alone now, in New York, not far from my laboratory. The arrangement suits me. I require very little space to live and considerable space to think. My rooms are orderly, predictable, each object placed with intention, not habit. Disorder consumes attention. I prefer to conserve it. My routine is simple. I work late into the night, often until dawn if the problem warrants it. I eat lightly and at consistent hours. I walk each evening, usually the same route, not because it is interesting, but because it is familiar. Familiar paths free the mind to move elsewhere. During these walks, I observe lamps, wires, the uneven distribution of power across the city, the inefficiencies people accept because they have grown accustomed to them. Habit is the enemy of progress. The more I watch the world adopt alternating current, the more clearly another limitation revealed itself. Power could now be generated and transmitted efficiently, yes, but it was still crude in its delivery, bulky, restrained by distance and infrastructure, tethered to copper and insulation and loss. We had solved one problem and exposed another. Electricity behaved beautifully in theory. In practice, it was still confined, constrained by methods that treated it as something to be contained rather than guided. I found this unsatisfying. Nature does not move in straight lines. Why should our systems insist upon it? I began to think less about generation and more about behavior, how energy moved, how it oscillated, how it might be encouraged rather than forced. These thoughts came not in bursts, but in slow repetition, returning again and again during my walks, during my meals, during the quiet hours in the laboratory when the machinery rested and only the hum of the city remained. The induction motor had been necessary. It had been correct. But it was not the end. It was a foundation. I did not speak much of these thoughts to others. There was no need. Most people were still celebrating what had already been achieved. I was already considering what would inevitably be required next. A system that did not merely transmit power, but refined it. A way to work with electricity at a higher level of precision. A method that reduced waste not just in distance, but in form. These were not ambitions. They were necessities. I understood then that the next invention would not come from demand or competition, but from discomfort, from the quiet dissatisfaction that arises when a solution is correct but incomplete. That discomfort is what I listen for. It was already present, and it would not allow me to rest for long. At that time, I lived in New York City. My rooms were modest, situated near my laboratory so that distance would never become an excuse. I have never cared for grand accommodations. Space, when poorly considered, creates distraction. I required only what allowed my mind to remain unencumbered. I stayed in rented rooms rather than a permanent home. This too was intentional. Permanence encourages attachment. Attachment introduces compromise. I preferred arrangements that could be changed easily, abandoned if necessary, without regret. My laboratory was separate from where I slept, but close enough that the walk between them became part of my thinking. I would leave my rooms late in the evening, coat buttoned, hat low, stepping into streets that were already losing their urgency. By the time I returned, the city would be quiet, its energy reduced to a steady hum beneath the surface. This rhythm suited me. New York in 1889 was restless, expanding faster than its systems could properly support. Wires crossed overhead in careless patterns. Power lines multiplied without elegance. Each addition solved a short-term problem while introducing a longer one. The city was learning quickly, but not thoughtfully. I observed all of it. My days were predictable. I ate lightly, often the same meals prepared the same way. Novelty in such matters has never appealed to me. Consistency reduces decision-making. Decision-making should be reserved for meaningful problems. In the evenings, I walked, always alone, often the same route. Down familiar streets, past lamps I had already studied countless times. People sometimes recognized me. Occasionally they spoke. I responded politely but briefly. Conversation rarely improves a line of reasoning. During these walks, ideas arranged themselves without effort. The movement of my body allowed the movement of my thoughts. I did not force conclusions. I allowed observations to repeat until patterns became unavoidable. When I returned to my laboratory, I worked until fatigue appeared. Not physical fatigue, but the subtle kind that dulls precision. At that point, I stopped. Continuing beyond that threshold produces errors. I have always respected my limits, even when others believed I ignored them. Sleep came later, sometimes only for a few hours. I have never required much. My mind remains active even at rest. Ideas do not obey schedules. Living this way was not a sacrifice. It was simply alignment. Everything unnecessary was removed. What remained was sufficient. From these rooms, from these routines, the next problem continued to take shape. Electricity was everywhere now, but it was still treated as something crude, something to be contained, directed, constrained. The infrastructure grew heavier as demand increased. More copper, more insulation, more loss accepted as unavoidable. I could not accept that. Efficiency had guided my previous work, and it continued to guide my thinking now. Not efficiency as measured by profit or convenience, but efficiency as harmony, a system that works with nature rather than against it. The success of alternating current had proven that prevailing assumptions could be overturned. That alone was valuable. It suggested that other assumptions, long accepted, rarely questioned, might also be incorrect. I felt no pressure to act immediately. The solution was not yet clear, but the need was undeniable. And when a need persists long enough, the mind begins, quietly, to assemble the answer. For now, I continued to live simply, walk nightly, and listen carefully to what the world was asking for next. As my days settled into this pattern, the world around me continued to press forward, whether thoughtfully or not. In the months following the acceptance of alternating current, my name appeared more frequently than I preferred. Lectures were requested, interviews attempted. Investors arrived with ideas already formed, seeking endorsement rather than understanding. I declined most of these invitations. Explanation is useful only when it advances the work. Attention rarely does. I was aware, of course, of the broader landscape in which I was operating. Thomas Edison still loomed in public conversation, his system entrenched in places where momentum mattered more than merit. George Westinghouse, practical and patient, understood the value of what we had accomplished and allowed it to develop without unnecessary interference. Others watched from a distance, cautious, waiting to see which direction the future would settle. I did not concern myself with competition. Progress is not a race. It is a correction. The electrical systems spreading through cities were growing more complex, not more refined. Each new solution introduced layers of support, additional material, more weight. Power stations multiplied, lines thickened. Loss was calculated, accepted, and accounted for as though it were unavoidable. I found myself returning to a simple question. Why should distance diminish energy at all? This was not a challenge to practicality, but to assumption. We had built systems around what we believed electricity to be, rather than exploring what it might allow if treated differently. Alternating current was only the beginning of that reconsideration. At night, in my laboratory, I revisited experiments from years earlier. Work I had set aside not because it failed, but because the world was not ready to understand it. I studied oscillations carefully, noting how systems behaved when allowed to move freely, rather than constrained to rigid expectations. Resonance interested me more than transmission. A properly tuned system does not require force. It responds. Energy, when aligned with its natural tendencies, amplifies itself. This principle appears everywhere in nature, yet we seemed determined to ignore it in engineering. I took notes sparingly. I have always preferred to hold ideas internally until they stabilize. Writing too early fixes thought prematurely. I allowed concepts to circulate, to return repeatedly, to change subtly each time. My living arrangements remained unchanged. The same rooms, the same walks, the same measured meals. Stability in the mundane allows flexibility in thought. Occasionally, I attended gatherings out of obligation rather than interest. These were tolerable in small doses. I listened more than I spoke. When asked about future projects, I responded vaguely. Precision invites misunderstanding when shared too early. What I knew, even then, was that the next advancement would not be visible at first glance. It would not announce itself with scale or noise. It would begin quietly, at a level most people did not think to examine. Electricity, I was convinced, could be elevated from a utility to a discipline, something tuned rather than imposed, something refined. This conviction did not excite me, it steadied me. I continued to walk the same streets, passing the same lamps, watching their steady glow against the dark. Each one was a reminder of progress achieved and progress deferred. Each one revealed both capability and limitation. I was not yet building anything new, but I was preparing. And preparation, when done properly, is indistinguishable from patience. Time moved forward without announcement. Weeks passed, then months, marked not by events, but by refinement, by the slow narrowing of questions, by ideas that no longer dissolved when left unattended overnight. I did not notice the shift at first. It revealed itself the way alignment often does, through absence rather than presence. Certain uncertainties stopped returning. Certain problems no longer demanded attention. By early 1890, New York had grown louder, but my work had grown quieter. I had taken a larger room for the laboratory, not out of ambition, but necessity. Experiments that involve oscillation require space, not for spectacle, but for safety and clarity. Objects too close to one another influence behavior in ways that are difficult to measure. I preferred distance. Distance allows honesty. The new space was still modest by any reasonable standard. Bare floors, plain tables, shelves that held only what was actively in use. I discarded more than I kept. Every object in the room needed to justify its presence. If it did not contribute to understanding, it created noise. I spent long periods doing nothing that would be recognizable as work. This concerned some of the people around me. They mistook stillness for stagnation. They believed invention required visible motion. I did not correct them. Explanation would not have helped. In truth, the work had simply moved inward. I was thinking more about behavior than construction, about what electricity did when it was not being forced to serve a narrow function, about how it responded when allowed to oscillate without resistance beyond what was necessary to maintain form. The prevailing systems of the time treated electricity as something to be restrained tightly, contained within lines, regulated by heavy components, loss accepted as a cost of doing business. I found this philosophy inelegant. Elegance is not decoration, it is an economy of effort. I reviewed reports from power stations, not the summaries, but the raw observations. Heat loss, signal degradation, maintenance failures. The same patterns appeared repeatedly. More material was added to compensate for inefficiency. which only increased complexity and introduced new failure points. We were building outward when we should have been refining inward. During this period, my routine became even more regular. I woke later in the day, ate once, sometimes twice, walked the same routes, returned to the laboratory as evening settled, worked through the quiet hours until the city began to stir again. People imagine this as isolation. I experienced it as clarity. The human mind is easily distracted by novelty, by conversation, by obligation. Removing these does not diminish thought. It sharpens it. Ideas began to present themselves not as solutions, but as constraints. Certain frequencies produce stability. Others introduced unnecessary strain. Certain arrangements allowed energy to build naturally, while others demanded constant correction. These observations were not new, but they were beginning to connect. I thought often about wireless transmission, not as a goal, but as a consequence. If energy could be encouraged to behave properly, distance would become less relevant. The notion was considered impractical by most. I did not find it so. I found it premature. Premature ideas fail, not because they are incorrect, but because the surrounding understanding is insufficient to support them. I did not intend to repeat that mistake. Instead, I focused on the nature of oscillation itself, on how energy accumulates when conditions are correct, on how small inputs, properly timed, can produce disproportionate effects. Nature does this constantly. Engineers rarely allow it. There were evenings when I would sit in the laboratory with the lights off entirely, listening to the city through the walls, the hum of distant generators, the faint rhythm of alternating systems working at scale. Even imperfect, they carried a kind of music, order struggling toward refinement. I learned to hear when something was wrong. This sensitivity extended beyond machinery. It applied to my own thinking as well. When an idea produced tension, I set it aside. When it returned calmly, unchanged, I examined it more closely. Gradually, a direction emerged. Not a device, a principle. Energy did not need to be controlled more aggressively. It needed to be guided more intelligently. Systems should resonate rather than resist, amplify rather than suppress, work with natural tendencies instead of imposing artificial limits. This realization did not arrive with certainty. It arrived with relief. Many of my earlier frustrations dissolved under this framework. Problems that had seemed unrelated now shared a common cause. We were designing systems that fought their own behavior. I did not yet know how to correct this fully, but I knew where not to look. Heavier infrastructure would not solve it. More insulation would not solve it. Louder demonstrations would not solve it. The answer would be smaller, more precise, more disciplined. By the time spring approached, I was no longer restless. The success of alternating current felt distant now, not because it was insignificant, but because it had served its purpose. It had proven that assumptions could be overturned. It had bought time. It had bought freedom. Freedom is often misunderstood as the ability to do anything. I have always understood it as the ability to do only what matters. I was no longer searching broadly. The field had narrowed. I had not yet begun the work that would later draw attention. That would come. But the groundwork was being laid quietly, internally, without announcement. When I walked the streets at night, I noticed fewer lamps. Or rather, I noticed them differently. Not as points of light, but as nodes in a system that was still learning how to behave. I felt no urgency to hurry it along. Understanding, when forced, fractures. When allowed, it settles into place. I was allowing it. The idea did not arrive as a sudden departure from what I had been thinking. It arrived as a continuation. By the time I allowed myself to work directly with higher frequency oscillations, the direction was already set. I was no longer asking how to send electricity farther or how to contain it more securely. I was asking how to let it behave in a way that was natural, predictable, and precise. This shift mattered. Alternating current had taught me that electricity preferred motion. Oscillation was not a flaw to be corrected, but a condition to be understood. Yet the frequencies we commonly used were low, chosen for convenience rather than possibility. They worked, but they did not reveal much. I began to increase them. Not dramatically at first. Small adjustments, incremental changes. I wanted to observe behavior, not provoke it. At higher frequencies, electricity behaves differently. Resistance diminishes. Conductors respond in ways that defy ordinary expectation. Effects appear that are not visible at lower ranges. This interested me. I did not yet think of it as a device. I thought of it as an arrangement, a way of organizing components so that energy could oscillate freely, building upon itself, rather than being dissipated prematurely. The earliest forms were simple, a primary circuit, a secondary, carefully tuned, loosely coupled, each element placed with intention, not symmetry. I had learned long ago that symmetry can mislead. Balance matters more. When I activated these early arrangements, the effects were subtle but unmistakable. Sparks appeared where none should have. Currents moved across surfaces rather than through them. Materials behaved as though their properties had changed, though they had not. I observed without excitement. Excitement introduces noise. I spent long hours adjusting spacing, winding coils by hand, testing different geometries. The work was repetitive, but repetition is not monotony when each pass removes a small uncertainty. My hands learned the feel of the wire. My eyes learned the difference between instability and transition. The laboratory remained quiet. The city beyond it continued to grow louder, but inside, the work required silence. High-frequency systems are sensitive. They reveal themselves only when interference is minimized. I began to see that resonance was the key. When two systems are properly tuned, energy transfers between them efficiently, almost effortlessly. No force is required, no coercion. The relationship itself does the work. This principle appeared again and again, not only in electrical systems, but in mechanical ones, in acoustics, even in human behavior. The implications were broad. If energy could be accumulated through resonance rather than brute input, many of the limitations we accepted would dissolve. Distance, size, loss. These were not absolute constraints. They were artifacts of poor alignment. I did not yet attempt demonstrations. I did not invite observers. The work was not ready for interpretation. Interpretation comes later. Understanding must come first. During this period, my routine remained unchanged. Night work, evening walks, sparse meals, sleep when necessary, not when customary. The discipline of the mundane allowed freedom in the complex. I noticed changes in myself as well. My thoughts had become quieter, more focused. The constant return to first principles had removed distractions. Problems presented themselves already partially solved, their unnecessary elements stripped away. The arrangement I was refining would later be given a name. At the time, it did not require one. It was simply a means of studying behavior at higher frequencies, a tool for observation rather than proclamation. Still, I understood that something important was taking shape. Not an invention in the usual sense. Not yet. A method, a way of engaging with electricity that treated it as a partner rather than an adversary, that respected its tendencies instead of restraining them, that allowed small inputs to produce meaningful effects when conditions were correct. I continued carefully. The work demanded restraint. High-frequency energy is unforgiving of carelessness. Small errors produce outsized consequences. Precision was no longer optional. It was the work itself. As the months progressed, the behavior of these systems became more familiar, less surprising, more consistent. What had once appeared mysterious began to feel orderly. That was when I knew the foundation was sound. There was still much to be done, much to test, much to refine. But the path forward was no longer uncertain. I was no longer merely observing electricity. I was beginning to speak its language. I did not think of it as an ending. That would have been premature. What I felt in those later nights was a kind of settling. The sense that a door had been located, if not yet opened. The apparatus before me no longer felt foreign or tentative. It behaved consistently, predictably. It responded to adjustment the way a well-understood system should. That, more than any visible effect, told me I was close. I remained careful not to confuse capability with completion. Many devices can be made to perform impressive actions without understanding. Sparks, light, sound. These things attract attention, but they do not explain themselves. I resisted the urge to pursue spectacle. Spectacle would come later, whether I wanted it or not. For now, my concern was coherence. The principles I was working with no longer felt isolated. Resonance, oscillation, efficiency. They formed a single line of reasoning. Each experiment confirmed the last, not by surprise, but by agreement. The system was beginning to behave as expected, which is the highest compliment one can give a design. My nights grew quieter still. There were evenings when I would complete a series of tests and then sit without moving, allowing the results to echo internally, not analyzing, not recording, simply letting the understanding settle into place. I have learned that some conclusions cannot be reached actively. They must be received. Outside, New York continued to change. New lines were installed. New demands placed upon power. The city was becoming increasingly dependent on systems it did not fully understand. I observed this without concern. Dependency precedes refinement. It always has. I felt no urgency to present what I was doing. The work was not finished, but it was no longer fragile. The foundation could support what would come next. That knowledge brought a rare kind of calm, not satisfaction, alignment. I understood then that this method of working with electricity would extend beyond a single device. It would inform everything that followed: transmission, transformation, control. Not through force, but through cooperation with the underlying behavior of energy itself. This realization did not change my routine. I still walked at night, still worked alone, still preferred quiet to explanation. But my attention had shifted forward. The groundwork had been laid. The system understood. What remained was to show, carefully and deliberately, what such understanding made possible. That would come in time. For now, it was enough to sit in the dim light of the laboratory, the apparatus resting silently before me, knowing that the question I had been listening for had finally learned how to answer back. And that, I knew, was where the real work would begin.